everyone for coming, but most of all, thank Sandy for being here, and who's going to be our speaker this morning, speaking on the paradox of German high-level cryptography.
Thank you. So I'll start, of course, by first thanking both the Institute and its director for the invitation to be here. It's my second time. It's a wonderful place. And I'm particularly grateful as well to the organizers, June and Deborah Kent, June Barrow Green and Deborah Kent, for the actual formal invitation. I should probably start by spending 1 or 2 minutes just explaining how I came to be interested in this arcane topic. And so I've had a long-standing interest in, going back about 3 decades, to Alan Turing, but in particular, his use and the more general use at Bletchley Park of probability and statistics in the attack on German encryption systems. And in fact, and others, I.J. Good, who was a pioneer in Bayesian statistics after the war, but who picked up the Bayesian approach because of his working with Turing very closely for a 2-year period during the war. But actually there were dozens of talented mathematicians who worked at Bletchley Park during the war, many of whom went on to distinguished careers, either staying on or going back to GCHQ after the war, or in various universities in the UK. But this research, and recently there's an article that sort of briefly gives some listing of these people, these mathematicians. But doing that work raised a natural question, which was, what about the other side? I mean, at that point, just before the war, Germany was the preeminent mathematical power in the world, at least before the expulsion of Jewish professors when the Nazis came to power. And it seemed hard to credit that none of them were working in the cryptological area, even though you had dozens of highly talented British and UK and US mathematicians doing that. And so I started looking into that, and I'll very briefly point out a connection to a couple of themes that have been raised meeting last week. And so one of them is that the collaboration. And so I was very fortunate early on to be able to collaborate with Frode Vierud, who was then at CERN and now retired in Norway. He's been interested in the history of cryptography for about 50 years. So it's a very, very knowledgeable person, and so a pleasure and privilege to collaborate with him. And so this is very much joint work with Frode. So we started working on this, and it turned out that there were some German mathematicians who worked in cryptology. In fact, it turned out there were a lot of German mathematicians who worked in cryptology. And so this, initially we thought maybe relatively modest program turned out to take 4 years of pretty intensive work. And in the end, we published a fairly long article in Cryptologia, which is the leading journal for the history of cryptology. And so that's titled German Mathematicians in Cryptology in World War II. But so there were two surprises. So one surprise, as I mentioned, is how many people there really were. But the other surprise was there were interviews of these people, as I'll explain in a minute, and many of them were quite conscious of the fact that they had serious problems with their encryption systems. And so that led to, we touched on this briefly at the end of our earlier paper, but that's now morphed into a project in itself. And so that's the topic of today's talk. Now, what's the point of this title? Well, nowadays we have to be especially careful about plagiarism and so on. So this title is not original with us. In 1946, the ASA, that's the U.S. Army Security Agency, had a document, book, basically, and chapter 1 of it has this title, The Paradox of German high-level cryptography, and it starts off, the very first sentence says, German high-level cryptographic systems were insecure, although brilliantly conceived. So this is a great initial sentence. I mean, if you actually, and there are some nice sites online that explain the actual mechanics of these machines, and the Enigma is a very interesting, clever, brilliantly conceived machine. And yet, despite that, these machines were turned out to be insecure. Now, there were a number of reasons for this. There was organizational redundancy. There were actually 6 different organizations: the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Wehrmacht, which is like the Ministry of Defense, so the overarching, the Foreign Office, and also the Nazi Party itself had so that it could spy internally. But this redundancy means that you diffuse resources and also had some other negative consequences. There was a lack of in particular, lack of coordination. And so now I'm going to avoid technical details almost entirely in this talk, a little bit. But the Poles actually broke the Enigma in 1932. They were able to read most messages, 75, 85% of the messages for a 6-year period until at least the end of 1938. And there were 2 new wheels that were introduced in 1939, and that would ordinarily have just killed things, except because of miscoordination between 2 of the agencies. This gave the Poles a way in. Alex might say a little more about that later. But I mean, lack of coordination when you're using the same equipment, but you're not cooperating and coordinating, can lead to real problems. And then there was inter and intra-service obstruction. So for example, early on, so WWII, and I'll explain what this means later, but this was the Wehrmacht's Cipher Bureau, and that, the Department of Defense is separate from the Army per se, and the Army refused to give WWII real traffic so that they could actually monitor what was going on, which, as you'll see, was a disaster. And then ignorance, and that'll be the focus really of today's talk, although all of these others will be illustrated as well. Okay, so now one very important resource in this is something called TICOM, the Target Intelligence Committee. This was an organization set up at the end of the war that was tasked with acquiring German signals intelligence assets, so personnel, equipment, intercepts. And so it's analogous to Operation Paperclip, which was this program to scoop up German rocket scientists. And there was also a similar program for German atomic scientists as well. So the idea was, let's get these people before the Russians do, find out what they did, and so on. Well, there was a similar operation for signals intelligence. So you might think that this is just, the important stuff of rockets and the atomic bomb and so on. This was sort of a sideshow. But in fact, over about a 6-year period, they interviewed literally hundreds of people, and they issued hundreds of reports that have now been declassified. So this is, most of which have been declassified. So this is an invaluable resource. Much of this is now summarized in a 9-volume book, European Signal Intelligence, European Axis Signal Intelligence. So I'm going to refer to that in the future as EASY, European Axis Signal Intelligence, in World War II, as revealed by TICOM investigations and other prisoner of war interrogations and captured material, principally German. Long title, but basically European Axis Signal Intelligence. This was a 9-volume, so this is in May 1946, so they've only been going for about a year, but they now issue a 9-volume summary of what they've found. So that gives you a sense that they were looking at lots of stuff. And this, by the way, there's a volume on the Army and the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht and so on, but there's not one on the Navy. The Army, this was the Army Security Agency. I guess they thought they'd leave that to the Navy guys. Okay, so when you go through this, there's what I call the anatomy of failure. And so I'm going to show this list now and then at the end, but so this is, if you like, a set of promissory notes, and subsequently I will try to redeem those. So one is inadequate infrastructure. So in particular, there was no formal security organization. Now, when I'm saying security throughout the talk, I mean intelligence security, communications security. There was no security organization prior to the war. Okay? You don't have a set of people who are tasked with saying, okay, we have these systems, are they secure? Okay? Things are developing. Is that a problem? No. They have no security organization prior to the war. And they had effectively, we'll see with one very significant exception, no mathematicians prior to the war. Secondly, there was bureaucratic inertia in acting on detected insecurities. So even when someone spots something, you have problems with the bureaucracy in terms of getting something done, let alone in then developing and fielding new systems. So there's a serious bureaucratic issue. Finally, there's the failure, what I call the failure of imagination. Systems are innocent until proven guilty. It's not enough to tell us that this is a theoretical potential insecurity. You have to show it actually is an insecurity. In effect, you have to show us it's being exploited, then we'll do something. And also underestimating the opponent's resources. And arguably, this resulted from mid-level mismanagement. Because the guys at the very top wanted to do things right, but if you're in the middle, somehow you don't want to admit that we've had this problem that's been persisting for the last 5 years. Now, by the way, let me just make a comment about the TICOM stuff. This is a terrific resource for two reasons. So first of all, historians are acutely sensitive to the problems of memory and the fact that 50 years after someone writes recollections, they can be seriously flawed. That's not a problem here. These are interviews that start as early as May of 1945. So these are people who within months had been actually doing the work. So there's no memory issue. They're talking about the immediate past. And secondly, there's this issue of hindsight is 20/20. So you say someone, well, you know, we've been exploiting the enigma and reading lots of messages, and then the person might say, well, you know, we sort of had some uneasiness and uncertainty. No, no, no. The fact that the Allies had been able to exploit the signals intelligence was considered a highly secret fact. And so that information was completely kept from the people who were being interrogated. And so as a result, if they say, you know, we were uncertain, it's not because you told them that it is insecure, it's because that's what they actually believe. They're telling the Allied interrogators that information without any knowledge of what actually had happened. Okay, so now inadequate infrastructure. The Wehrmacht, the overall Ministry of Defense, if you like, but underneath it, there is the Army, the Kriegsmarine, the Navy, and the Luftwaffe, the Air Force. And then there's an OKW, is the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. And in it, OKW Cipher, is its Cipher Bureau, which had existed in some form since 1922. Okay, so you have these things where reorganization and so on happens, but this basically is an organization that goes back to 1922. But it only had an advisory security function. It couldn't actually do things. It could advise you. It could say, you have a problem, but it couldn't enforce something to happen. And there's also OKH, the Oberkommando des Heeres. You'll forgive my German pronunciation if it's off. This had no, so this is the actual Army High Command, and it had no communications security agency before the war. Okay, so when the war breaks out, they have all these, these hand systems, these machines, and so on, but they had no group that was tasked with actually figuring out how secure these things are. And they also actually only had limited signals intelligence assets before the war either. So in fall of 1939, something called In-74 was set up. That's the security guys. So war breaks out, and that's when they set up immediately this agency or group for security. And in winter of 1941, so about 2.5 years later, they set up In-76, which is charged with cryptanalysis. Now, they were obviously, they were doing cryptanalysis before that, but this was a central organization that sort of put everything under a common umbrella. That only got set up in the winter of 1941. There were essentially no mathematicians before the war. This contrasts with the Polish Cipher Bureau. In 1932, when Enigma traffic first started being detected by the Poles, they hired 3 mathematicians, Rejewski, Rosicky, and Zagalski. And later on, much later on, Rejewski wrote that he said in solving the Enigma, knowledge of the German language was very helpful. But knowledge of the language was not as familiar, not as useful as familiarity with mathematics. And the great contribution of various people upstairs was that considerably earlier than their counterparts in other cipher bureaus, they understood the usefulness of requiring cryptologists to be mathematics graduates as well as to know languages. And in fact, Rejewski, who was the best of the 3 and really was responsible for some of the most important breakthroughs, employed group theory as a major part of his attack on the Enigma. And here's a stamp. Many decades later, their accomplishments were made public, and here's a stamp Poland put out with all 3. Okay, some important personalities. I'm just going to mention them now, but their names are going to come up. In OKWC, so the Wehrmacht, the Wehrmacht organization, there was Wilhelm Fenner, who was the head of the cryptanalysis division from 1922, when things got started, all the way to the end of the war. He's in place all the time. And you can regard him as an organizational genius. He was not a particularly great cryptographer. In fact, he started out with no knowledge of cryptology, although he was a fast learner. But he wasn't particularly a gifted person. But he was fantastic at getting this organization created from nothing. Then there was a very interesting guy called Erich Huttenheim, who was their chief mathematical cryptologist. He's a very interesting character. He was interested in astronomy, but the guy he was working for as a postdoc was interested in dating the Mayan events by corresponding astronomical events that are reported. But Mayan was largely a language that about very little was known, so sort of figuring out what these texts are saying is like a form of cryptography, and that got Huttenheim interested in this. And so at some point he submitted a design for a system to the German military, and even though the particular thing was neither either really novel or secure, it was way more sophisticated than what your amateur might submit. So Fenner interviewed him and then hired him. So he's the first PhD mathematician that we know of who was joined the Wehrmacht before the war. And then the war comes and he's rises to position of considerable, he's basically after Fenner in this organization. After the war, the Allies think that he's such an important acquisition that they ship him off, and someone else I'll mention in a moment, to England for basically interviews for almost 2 years. To get as much information. And then when he gets sent back to Germany, he immediately joins something called the Organisation Gehlen and becomes part of their CRIP unit. And then in, I think it's 1955, when the BND, Bundesnachrichtendienst, is set up, he works for their CRIP organization all the way to 1970. So this guy is working as a technical professional from 1937 to 1970. Meanwhile, over in OKH, the Army group in N76, the cryptologist, there was Walter Fricke, who he first worked on security. And, how are the hand systems doing? Answer, not great. And so he became part of a group to create new systems. Then at some point he gets shipped over to OKW because after the July 20th, 1944 attempt to assassinate Hitler, some of the top signals people were, like the head of the Signal Corps, were heavily implicated in the plot. And so there was a big shakeup as a result. And so some of the personnel from this army organization got sent over to the Wehrmacht. And there's another guy called Heinrich Düring, who was the head of N76, the referat involved with security of machine ciphers. So Fricke worked on hand devices. Düring worked on machine ciphers. He's interesting too because he has a very so neither of these guys know anything about cryptography ahead of time. Düring got his PhD in 1939 in animal husbandry. Mathematics PhD, but it was in the field of animal husbandry. And after the war, he promptly goes back into animal husbandry. But during the war, he's an absolute whiz at detecting insecurities. He gets uniformly high grades from everybody. And there's a guy called Otto Bogisch, who was the deputy to Düring. He's, so-so, but he's an intelligent guy. He's interested. He's listening to everything. So he's a fantastic source of information, and as a result, a large fraction, not a large fraction, but there were many TICOM reports that are interviews of him, because he just knows a lot. I mean, not just his own organization, but he talks to other people, so he knows a lot of what's been going on. And so here's a picture of Fenner, very much an old school kind of guy, obviously. And this is a picture of Houtenhine dating from the mid-50s in Taiwan, when he's visiting some of his Taiwanese counterparts. So this is just to illustrate that he was very much active in post-war West German cryptography. Important, very important figure. Okay, so now case study one. Now, I'm making an apology at this point. I hate it when people skip slides, but I'm going to do that today because I timed myself last night twice, and I just decided some stuff has to get cut. So I'm going to talk about the Enigma, but I'm going to skip some of the technical details. Okay, so the Army Enigma consisted of, well, there was first of all a typewriter keyboard. There was something called a Stecker board. I'll explain all of these. They had 3 wheels, left, middle, and right. They had a so-called reversing wheel, the Umkehrwalze, and they had light bulbs. And now there was also a earlier commercial device which was basically the same, except there was no Stecker board. But it was known to be insecure. The Germans knew the commercial device was insecure. The British knew, probably the French. So that's why the Stecker board was added. So here's a picture of the famous Enigma. And well, let's see, I guess I could probably, so here are the keys. So that, when you're going to encrypt a message, you press one of the keys. And so electricity starts flowing, and this is the Stecker board. And what you have are letters that are paired. Okay, so you have these plugs. It's a little hard to see in this picture, but there are 2 prongs, and a plug will take you from one letter down to another letter. Then the electricity flows into the machine. I'll show you a schematic in a moment. It goes through, these are these 3 wheels. Then there's a reversing wheel that sends you back. You come back, you go through the Stecker board, and then one of these light bulbs lights up. And it's not so easy to see, but these wheels these 3 wheels we can see, there's a ring that's attached to it with letters. And so when you're setting the machine up, here's the wheel, and there's this lettered ring on the side, or sometimes referred to as a tire, and it's attached to the wheel, but you have 26 different ways you can attach it. If you like, imagine 26 numbers on the wheel, 26 letters on the ring, and which number is next to the letter A is part of the setup, okay? And then by, because of these wheels have little ratchets, you can turn it so that you can see a desired letter in the window. Okay, and here's the schematic. And so the key thing is just to remember this. So here's the keyboard, you press it. So here's the electricity. It enters the stecker board, and so in this case, you press the letter T, but the stecker board switches pairs of letters. So what was T now comes out as K. It goes through the Eintrittswalze, the entry wheel. Now, in the military version, this doesn't do anything. It's just the identity permutation. The commercial version, they actually had a genuine permutation, but this actually created problems for the British who were trying to figure out what was going on. They had to have the Poles tell them that was what goes on. And then you can see the electricity enters the wheels. So it enters here as one letter and then exits as another. So there's an arbitrary permutation via wiring. Then you exit the first wheel and enter the second and get switched to a different letter. You then exit, enter the third, exit, and then you go to the Umkehrwalze, the reflecting wheel, which sends you to some other wheel, and then you go all the way back, reversing, right? So the blue is the reverse path. You come in at W, that stecker board sends you to G, and then G lights up, okay? One thing that's important is if you think about it, suppose you started at G, the electricity would flow in the exact same way, but in the opposite direction. And so if you press T, you're going to get G, but equally if you press the G, you would get the T. So it has a reciprocal property, which is useful because you can use the same setting both to encrypt and decrypt. Okay, and here's a famous picture of General Guderian in his command vehicle, and you see these guys hunched over what looks like a typewriter, but it's actually the Enigma, and you can actually, if you look carefully, see those three wheels over there. Okay, questions? Okay, so I won't go through, so you have to set this thing up. So you pick the three wheels, you put them in some order, you attach the rings, you come up with some stecker board setting. That's all part of the daily key that everybody uses. But then you have to send a message key for the specific message. And the way it's done is the German military used the following procedure. They first had a Grundstellung, a sort of ground setting that everybody used, okay? And you take the message, so let's say CAM, okay, that's Grundstellung. So you set it to the Grundstellung. And now there's the message setting, the thing you're actually going to use. The setting is the three letters that you're seeing at the top of the machine. And so suppose your message setting is INI, then you encrypt that twice. So at the Grundstellung, you encrypt the actual message setting twice. Then you reset to the message setting. So you go from CAM to INI, and then you type in your message, thereby encrypting it. And then at the very end, you send this twice encrypted message setting together with the actual encrypted, so you need to send the first part so the other side can figure out what your message setting is, and then you send the encrypted message itself. It turns out that this procedure totally kills the machine in terms of security. Okay? The combination of the Grundstellung, but even without that, the double encryption of the message setting, although it's obviously good for avoiding errors and so on, makes this thing completely insecure. And that's how the Poles were able to exploit this. Okay, so the slides I'm going to skip now are, we're writing a paper and we discuss technically a variety of things. So I'll just, this one slide and then I'll skip. So from 1926 to 1932, the German military is developing this thing. On October 1st, 1936, they increased the number of stecker pairs, which was relatively low, up to maybe as many as typically 6. In 1937, they changed the reflecting wheel, the Umkehrwalze. Good, that's like changing your password. In September 15th, 1938, they discontinued the use of the Grundstellung. Good. In December 5th, 1938, they increased the number of wheels from 3 to 5. So you have these 3 wheels, but it used to be that you just permuted 3. On this end of 1938, they upped the number of wheels to 5. You chose 3 from the 5. And then on January 1st, 1939, there was a further increase in the number of Stecker pairs, up to 10. And then finally, on May 1st, 1940, they finally ditched the double encipherment of the indicator, of the message setting. So these are all good, except they fielded this machine in 1932, and this is happening 8 years later. Okay? So they're doing good things to upgrade the security, but stepwise. And each time they do it, the polls are until the very last step or so, keeping up and still exploiting the machine. So the point is, if you're going to, you should do all this up front. Ask people to figure these things out ahead of time, then field the machine. Okay, and so there are, the next slides discuss each of the technical aspects of these steps and why they were good things to do, but I'm going to skip that. But the key thing is to remember this double encipherment of the message setting is very bad. Okay, so I'm going to skip. One of them involved a guy called, one of the improvements was due to a guy called Fritz Menzer, increasing the number of Stecker pairs. So these are, the quotations are mostly from the TICOM reports. It was fully realized within WWII that a more efficient system was needed for dealing with German cipher security, but it took some time for the authorities concerned to act in this respect. In the old 1930s arrangement had left the sole responsibility in such matters to Oberinspector Menzer. Well, who was this guy? He was an old Reichswehr man who had joined WWII in 1935. He was not highly educated, but had been attracted to these problems. He devised new systems. His systems were usually introduced. Only occasionally did he consult Huttenheim, the mathematical expert, when questions of probability were involved. So this is the problem, right? Throughout the decade of the 1930s, now it's not like Menzer had interesting ideas. Some of his machines were interesting, but he's not a particularly well-trained person, and it's one person, and he's in charge of security. Okay, so on May 1st, 1940, the Germans stopped the double encipherment. Well, here too, what happened, they had reason after the outbreak of war to think there was a problem because when they occupied Warsaw, they found some decrypted Enigma messages. So they wondered, gee, are we really secure? And so they asked this new N74, the security guys, to investigate this. And so Peach, Steinberg, and Böhm, who were three mathematicians who had just been hired and knew nothing about cryptology, they did theoretical work and had come to the conclusion that the double encipherment of the indicators was not secure. And as a result of this work, N74 was able to force a change in the indicator system in 1940. So in other words, it's not like this was some super subtle insecurity. You hire three mathematicians who know nothing about cryptology, and in about 6 months, they figure out, you have to get rid of this. This is terrible. Okay. And here's another theme we'll be coming across, which is they knew their systems. So this is I-31, which is the interrogation of Dr. Huttenheim. They knew themselves that their systems needed improvement and were working on them. And in 1940-41, a special section was set up within WWII, the Wehrmacht organization, to test new systems, check on old ones. This was regarded by the services as an infringement on their rights and strongly resented. You know, who are these Wehrmacht interlopers telling us in the army or us in the Luftwaffe what to do? So there was no direct order from above that the necessary material for making tests was to be supplied, right? They needed someone on the top saying, give them this stuff. Nobody did that. And so requests for specimen live traffic were refused. They just got make-believe messages. Okay? The troops are walking down the Unter den Linden, something like that. And so only comparatively recently did this change. Okay, and so this was a problem even within a service. So in August 1942, N76, the crypt guys were ordered to collaborate with N74, the security guys, in setting up a department for the development of cipher procedures. Because at this point, they'd figured out, we have a problem. We need to replace the old hand systems with the new ones. Okay? It was considered, so this is the higher ups, it was considered undesirable that the personnel from N74 and N76, the crypt guys and security guys, should work together in that they might be unduly influenced by one another. N76, the cryptanalysts, did not agree with this viewpoint and stated that the personal responsibility for developing ciphers must be in continuous contact with the latest achievements of cryptography in order that a foolproof procedure should be evolved. Makes sense, right? You're devising a system. You'd like to run it by the experts in cryptanalysis to see, could you break the system? This viewpoint was not recognized. Okay, so they weren't permitted to do that. Okay, here's the second case study, which will go much faster because there won't be any real mention of the machine itself. The T52 was a teleprinter encryption machine. In 1939, Utenheim had shown that the T52AB, the letter just denotes the version A, B, C, D, E, but the A and B had the same cryptologic. There was just some minor change in the electromechanical implementation. So from our perspective, it's the same machine. So in 1939, he showed that this thing was insecure. He, quote, he found that it could be solved on 100 letters without a crib. If you do any reading in this subject, so crib is conjectured plain text. And so both the Germans and the Allies used this in their various cryptanalytic attacks. Okay? But he found, no, I don't even need a crib. If you just give me 100 letters of ciphertext, I can tell you what the message says, basically. I can break this if you give me 100 letters of ciphertext. Okay, well, in 1942, the T52 was still in use, although, presumably because of Utenheim's criticism, something called the T52C, a new machine to improve on the AB, was being distributed. In the summer of 1942, remember, this is during the animal husbandry whiz, reviews the machine and says, yeah, Utenheim was right, the AB is insecure. Well, okay, we have this new T52C that's coming online. What about that? In the fall of 1942, he says, oh, the T52C is still insecure. Disappointment, but you go back and at some point you ask for a new machine, the T52D, which is available the next year. In 1943, doing shows the T52D is insecure. So you have this comedy of errors that each time an insecurity is found, they go back and try to fix it, but they don't succeed. The T52E actually was secure, but you're talking almost the end of the war. So tail wagging the dog, how did the manufacturer respond to the criticisms? Well, OKW, she demanded a new alphabet, a similar drive, a variable pattern. Since we're not talking about the machine, I don't need to explain these, but the point is that OKW, she gave a very specific list of here are things that need to be changed. Siemens, the manufacturer, said, these are impossible, and they refused to consider them. The manufacturer is deciding on security of the machine. And they're just saying, technically, this is too demanding. We're not going to do that. The T52C model, therefore, satisfied none of the conditions and was still solvable, although the wiring was more complicated. It could be broken on a crib of 10 letters set by a parity condition and was solved in 3 months. That's to say, after 3 months, Turing figured out this is insecure. Power of wishful thinking. So this is another issue. The high command, largely out of wishful thinking, began to consider the misgivings of N76 as unwarranted, since the enemy wasn't in a position to tap lines, as was done in the security checks by the German personnel. That's to say, if you're sending an Enigma message, typically it's being sent over the air and it can get intercepted, and you can understand. Maybe someone can break that message. But if you're sending something by a landline, unless someone's actually physically tapping it, how do you get your hands on the message? And so when these teleprinter systems, say, are used to send messages from Berlin to Paris, at this point, all the land in between is in occupied territory. How could it be, tapped? So why worry? This comforting thought, however, was dashed in 1942-3 when an entire cellar for tapping telephone and teleprinter traffic was raided in Paris. It was technically excellently equipped. And then there's another episode, I don't have it on the slides, but in April 1940, Germany occupied Norway. And so basically the day after they occupy it, they contact Swedish telecommunications, which Sweden was neutral. And they tell Swedish telecommunications, we would like to use the Norwegian cables that are running through Sweden, because that way we can communicate with, then that'll go on and we can then communicate with Berlin. So we would like you, Sweden, neutral country, to let us use these cables from Norway through Sweden. And Sweden says, yes, because, of course, they then proceed to tap these lines. They enlist one of their most brilliant mathematicians. He, just like other people, break the system. And for 3 years, the Swedes are reading this teleprinter traffic until finally a secure device is used. But you're talking 3 years later. Okay, I'll skip that slide. It's just someone who says, please send me the keys for the new machine in the clear. Which doesn't, like using an unencrypted email to say what your password is, or something like that. Okay, now, when did we start, roughly?
We've got 20 minutes left.
Okay, so I will try to finish the talk proper, no more than 10:30. Okay, so not everyone agreed. So this raises, so these case studies show that some of the development problems. But what about the people in the military? Not everybody agreed the Enigma was secure, a point which came out fairly clear in these and other interrogations of the IC, that's to say the intelligence staff of the German Air Ministry. There have always been Germans who did not think the Enigma was secure. So Oberst Wodarg, Oberst is colonel, Oberst Wodarg of the German Air Force intelligence staff had this opinion recorded in the war diary at the time of the North African landings in November 1942. So this guy is on his toes. He says, I don't think this is secure. And he demanded that General Martini, who was the Director General of Luftwaffe signals, to countersign this. Now, I don't know much about the German army during World War II, but I do know enough to know there must have been very unusual. Now, by the way, Wodarg was an Oberst at the end of the war. At the time of this episode, he was Oberstleutnant, Lieutenant Colonel. And the Director General of Luftwaffe signals is the 3-star general rank. And it must be pretty unusual for a lieutenant colonel to try to boss around a 3-star general, but that's exactly what happened here. He demanded that Martini countersign, so he obviously thought very strongly about this. General Martini, on being thus confronted, reduced his earlier belief in 100% security to 80% security. They don't explain what that means. I have a conjecture, but it's just purely speculative, which is if you monitor the traffic, maybe you detect that 20% of the time inappropriate procedures are being used that imperil the security of the transmission, and that's where this 80% is coming from. They're observing that 20% of the time, despite what we're telling them, the operators are doing the wrong things. Martini is this general of the air communications troops. And he was a pretty bright guy who, after the war, played an important role, among other things. I mean, as a Wikipedia page, after the war, he played an important role in the development of German radar, was very highly regarded by his European counterparts. Okay, so this had consequences, this little entry, because HUD-3, which is the cryptanalysis of Army and Luftwaffe traffic, remembers that General Martini, about that time, November 42, banned operational orders by wireless telegraphy. So in other words, Martini took this seriously. And so from then on, the things that were operational, with, serious stuff, could not be sent by wireless telegraphy. The interrogators maintained suitably blank expressions during these revelations. That's this, they're not letting on about how much they knew about, how much they had broken the systems. So they're just poker-faced. And then this just says that in my minority view that the Germans were making all these changes during the war was precisely because this supports a minority view that actually they were aware that there were problems. Okay, General Gimmler replaced General Erich Feldgiebel on August 17, 1944. So Feldgiebel was involved in he was the chief signal officer, but he was involved in the coup, so he was dismissed immediately and then shot in September. And so this I'll skip through too, but this is basically a speech from Gimmler which makes it clear that he took his job very seriously. It's a pep talk saying we're doing important stuff. The cryptologic war is very important. There is a fascinating part towards the end where he's saying that the Americans have learned from the British and now work on cryptanalysis, for example, with the assistance of the most modern mechanical devices. So I don't know that anyone has actually followed up on this, but this suggests the Germans had more knowledge of what was going on than might commonly be believed. And then this is more pep talk. Except, I guess over here, he says no secure method of speech encryption exists. The most secure method is to either use a courier or the teleprinter. He doesn't mention the Enigma. He obviously thinks you can't trust the Enigma. And here's a picture of him. There's not a whole lot available about him, but this was a picture I was able to find. Okay, so sense of unease. So after General Gimmler assumed command of Wehrmacht Communications, there were a series of 4 security conferences. Dr. Bugish reported worry was also expressed over the fact the machine hadn't been changed throughout the war. They didn't change the wheels or anything like that. They just used the exact same device. Dr. Huttenheim said, although there are no facts available to enable him to conjecture a practical solution, because he's not getting live traffic. So they do security investigations, but it's all theoretical. Suppose they know the structure of the device. Suppose they have a crib with 20 letters, that kind of thing. But they don't actually have real traffic to look at. So that's why he doesn't have those facts. But he never lost the feeling of uncertainty about the Enigma. This is their chief cryptanalyst in the Army, and he's uncertain about whether this device is insecure. Dr. Fricke, so he's fantastic. So he's the astronomer, right? He got his degree in 1939. As soon as the war is over and he's released, he goes back to astronomy where he has a very distinguished career. Dr. Fricke said they had always wanted to work on their own traffic, just as they would do on foreign material, but were never given the opportunity. Whoops, no, sorry, wrong way. They never knew how the Army actually used the systems which they put out. They never saw any real traffic. Now, even though Fricke didn't know anything about cryptography when he was enlisted, well, not enlisted, when he was drafted, he was a bright guy, quick learner, and he wasn't just the math, he knew practical aspects. And he said, so why is this a problem? They often reflected that the work on Russian systems showed that those systems were secure if properly used. The actual systems Russians were using were really good. But if the cryptographers in Moscow could only see how they were used, they would be very unhappy. Okay? So it's theoretical security isn't enough. You have to monitor usage. Otherwise, you're in trouble. Resistance at the top. This is still Fricke. Whenever the Army was asked to change the system, there was a storm of protest. It was not the cryptanalysts like Fricke, but the HNV staff, which made the decision on the methods to be used. And how did that turn out? Results depended on whether the officer at HNV at the time happened to know anything about cryptography. He usually did not. In 1942, all-hand systems were solvable. Fricke speak with authority about that because he was the guy in charge of reviewing these systems. He knew every system, so he was painted all the systems and they were solvable. When the HNV was told this, the reply was that Germany had won all her battles so far using these systems, and there was no need to overload the troops with new methods. And here's a picture of Dr. Fricke. As I said, very distinguished career in astronomy afterwards. Dr. Bugish concurs. So Bugish is the deputy to the whiz kid during, and he observes lots of stuff. German security is a pet subject with Bugish. His story is that up to 1942, the machines and systems introduced were not checked mathematically for security. When Düring in that year pointed out the weakness of the early T-52s to the higher-ups, it was decided to check all devices, but the liaison was still bad, tragicomic, and even if insecurity was detected, it was hard to get action. Conversely, it was very hard to get action on new devices. He has the almost inevitable comment about the military non-technicians who block things. Now, by the way, let me point out two things about this. German security is a pet subject with Bugish. So this isn't a one-off where one time he mentions this. He's obviously constantly reiterating this theme. And secondly, he has the almost inevitable comments, which suggests that we're hearing this from everybody almost. When we ask anybody about comments about security, this is what they'll say. Well, what's wrong with the Enigma, right? You're this math guy. I mean, do you have any concrete criticisms? Well, according to Dr. Bugish, the weaknesses of the Enigma were rotor 1, that's the one to the right, which moved uniformly. Rotors 2 and 3, the middle and leftmost ones, moved too infrequently. 1 in every 26 for the middle one, 1 in every 676 for the left one. The machine should have had more than 3 rotors. They were selecting from 5, but there were 3 rotors in the machine. He thought, well, you could have more rotors than 3. There should have been more than 5 rotors to choose from. Actually, the Navy used 8. And the reflector wasn't pluggable. That would have been a more secure thing to Stecker rather than the outside of the machine. Well, what about that? Dr. Bugish was so right. Improvement in any one of the foregoing particulars could easily have pushed the plugboard Enigma beyond the reach of already straining Anglo-American cryptanalytic fingers and possibly altered the course of the war. If any one of these 5 things were done, we would have had a big problem. But the same machine was used throughout the entire war. Okay, the very last part, failure of imagination. So OKM, that's the high command of the Marine, the Navy. 4 SKL are the signals guys, 2 is security. In a report, now in this study, you sometimes find strange things, but sometimes you find things that are sort of impossible to understand, at least for me. So in a report dated July 10th, 1944, the security guys wrote, a solution of the naval Enigma was conceivable. That's scary. The assumption of, based on the assumption of extraordinary mechanical outlay on the part of the enemy for cryptographic activities, which is exactly what Bletchley Park did, thanks to Winston Churchill. Although we can conceive of a machine which would be suitable for this kind of work, we have none available or under consideration, since the whole question does not yet appear to justify undertaking such a difficult special constructional problem. I mean, after all, given the time and the expense, and the money and the personnel, why would anyone go to all this trouble? I mean, the only thing that would happen would be they would maybe know where our U-boats are. I mean, it's just inconceivable. You know, if breaking the naval Enigma would enable you to identify the locations of U-boats, which it did, why do you think the opposition, the enemy, would not do these things? But however, they did commission someone, Hans Joachim Frohwein, a lieutenant, to look into this after studying the Enigma without any prior experience. So this guy doesn't know anything about the Enigma, but they say, take a look at it, see if you think it's insecure. He says, you know, in practice, Hollerith machinery, IBM cards could be used. With a 3-wheel Enigma, you'd only need 70,000 cards. They could have produced this at the beginning of the war. It would be valid through the lifetime of the Enigma. The first sorting process would take 200 machine hours, the second 8, and so on. Is this practical? Easy concluded this was within practical limits, noting it was just a first theoretical answer rather than the climax of a comprehensive practical attempt at solution. Okay, and then the final slide is Dr. Wolfgang Franz, who was a future president of the German Mathematical Society. He headed OKW's organization that was tasked with the hardest systems. If you had a new hard system, these were the guys you gave it to. He said in 1942, I had absolutely no overall picture of the cryptographic work at the Bureau. That's because he didn't know anything about cryptography when he came. Hence, I cannot say anything positive in this regard. Naturally, there was a general tendency to seek permanent improvement of our own crypto systems. Why? It was recognized that many systems regarded as unbreakable could nevertheless be solved if serious efforts were made. So hopefully I've convinced you that, and this is, again, without any knowledge of Allied successes. Here's a picture of Dr. Franz. This just is a slide. If you take a look at it, I claim that I had at the beginning, you'll see that every promissory note was redeemed. Some reading. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sandy. That was absolutely fascinating to hear it from the other side. I mean, being Britain and going to Bletchley Park and things, we, so sort of immersed in what was going on there, and it really was really interesting. Do we have questions?
So thank you very much. So this thing about operations research or operation analysis, it was called, did the Germans have any of that?
You mean in this particular field, or is it more generally?
During the second engaging kind of activities, they set up operational research groups as they did in the US and Britain.
I don't know. So I'm specialized in this. They did have people like Runge, and Tobias has written a book. So there have been people who've written about other people working, but whether operations, so like in aerodynamics and so on, but whether in operations research in particular, it's an excellent question, but I don't know.
So the Germans knew that their own systems weren't so secure, but did they break the English and American systems?
At the low level or intermediate level, so there was an American system called the M209, and they were able to break a lot of the naval codes, and so there are books, and also Easy discusses this. They had a lot of initial successes against systems, but the U.S. and Britain had some so the UK developed something called TypeX, and that was never broken. It was like a much more secure version of the Enigma. That was never broken. The US had something called Sagaba, which was another system that was never broken, and Six Sally, which was a voice encryption system. So the very highest systems were never broken, but lower level ones were.
Yeah, you worked quite a bit on the English side, also in Bletchley Park, and Guy Good most recently, right, and his use of Bayesian statistics to break Enigma. Probably also some number theory involved. Do we know anything about the mathematical methods which the Germans used to encrypt kind of messages or stuff? Did they use kind of Bayesian statistics too or something?
I don't know. I don't know about their using Bayesian statistics, but they did use a lot of mathematics, in particular group theory, for investigating the Enigma. And one source of information is an organization I haven't mentioned, was the Auswärtiges Amt, the Foreign Office. And they had actually very fine people and almost a sort of an academic approach. And so they issued research reports at various points. And so those will contain, technical information, and some of those are available now. So the Foreign Office basically makes anything they have now available. So there is some, a fair amount of information.
So thank you for this fascinating topic. I'd like to know which were the criteria that were adopted in order to hire, qualify as an expert.
That is a fantastic question. This guy, Huttenheim, identified really promising mathematicians who either had been drafted, like Teichmüller, or others who were and Karlstein, or others who were in danger of being drafted, and he systematically hired them so he could get them off the front and into a place where they could survive the war to continue German mathematics afterwards. And the reason we know this is because, so Huttenheim was the head of the BND cipher section, and a guy called Otto Leibrich was his successor, and Leibrich tells us this. So the head of the cipher bureau for the Bundesnachrichtendienst, at some point wrote about Huttenheim and said he specifically was doing this to get people off. So he had a personal agenda. Now, you could argue that in like the UK and the US, it might have been a sort of more of a national agenda. There wasn't one that I know of in Germany, but that's what Huttenheim personally was trying to do.
To this point, Teichmüller, as you certainly know, of course, in this case, it didn't work because he died at the Eastern Front, so it didn't always work to claim these, reclaim these mathematicians.
But it wasn't Huttenheim's fault, because
He could have saved himself, but he was fanatic.
right. Well, he was hired by Huttenheim, so he was taken off the front. But then later on, when whatever group he was in, things started going south for the German offensive in Russia. Teichmüller left the crypt guys and went back to the front.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments which kind of reflected well on some of the things that I did on the First World War. So there were two things that were very striking for me, that in the First World War in Britain, there was a real tension between mathematicians who felt that they were necessary in the area of sort of aeronautics and things, and the kind of fight against the sort of engineers who were wanting to just say, well, we'll get up in the air and fly the planes, and we'll be able to work out what's going wrong when they go into a spin and all this sort of thing. And there was a mathematician, Brian, and I mean, he gave a talk where he said, it was in the context of the artillery shell crisis we had in Britain, and they weren't making enough shells, and he said, they're saying what is wanted is more shells. He said, no, what is wanted is more algebra. And this tension between the tension between the military and the academics. So we see that again similarly. And there was somebody called A.V. Hill, who was he was recruiting mathematicians to work on anti-aircraft gunnery, and exactly to stop them from going to the front. And he was actually very successful in doing that. So it's kind of interesting seeing the same issues, just appearing again, but just in different contexts. Any other questions? Well, I think we thank Sandy again for a really fascinating